What would you say is the favorite chapter you had when you were writing it? Just like that you enjoyed writing the most. Maybe you
Yeah.
got to remember back in the day, but
Well, a lot of it came from more recent times as I just started to do
hmm,
a lot more research. There were a couple of different things. I just found out some interesting information. The first chapter talks about. It starts out with a statement that uh, Yuri Gagarin, who was the first person to actually get into outer space, right, and
hmm,
orbit the Earth, a Russian cosmonaut. And he said, well, I've gone up into space and I didn't encounter God. Now, this you got to remember, back then, the Soviet Union was officially atheist. And so they
hmm,
actually put together, you can Google it if you want to, um, an image, picture of a poster from the Soviet Union back at that time that says there is no God with a cosmonaut floating in space. And they made a
hmm,
big deal out of this, right? Well, then after that, I talk about the first moon landing. Actually, the first time we orbited the moon,
hmm.
a group of people, and then at the end, the first moon landing in 1969, which happened, by the way, the day after my 21st birthday, which I thought was kind of
Hmm.
interesting.
There you
Um,
go.
yeah, July 20th, 1969. But everybody knows the name of uh, Neil Anderson because he's the first person who walked on the moon. Well, the second person was Buzz Aldrin. He was uh, they were together in the capsule and they went down together. Uh, Neil Armstrong was the first one. Did I say Anderson? Is Neil Armstrong? Anyway, Neil Armstrong was the first person to actually walk on the moon. And about 30 minutes later, Buzz Aldrin came out and he walked on the moon. Well,
Hmm.
then he goes back into um, the what they call the LEM, the lunar module. LM is what it's. That's what the thing is. He went back in there, and he actually took communion. It was
Wow.
amazing. He had asked his pastor for if the pastor would prepare communion, and he took the communion. And afterwards he said, "Well, I couldn't think of a better way to acknowledge this phenomenal accomplishment than to thank God."
Hmm,
Like, wow, that was I didn't even know that. There's another interesting thing. People will say often, well, you have Mohammed and Buddha and Confucius. They all lived and they all died
hmm,
and they're dead. But Jesus, his tomb is empty. Well, I thought,
hmm,
I've said that many, many years. Well, what I
hmm.
found out was, do you realize that you can actually go and visit the grave of Muhammad?
Wow.
It's in Medina, Saudi Arabia. It's in a covered shrine there. Confucius is buried in the cemetery of Confucius in Khufu, Shandong province, China.
Hmm.
And Buddha was actually cremated, and his bones were given to different people as relics. But
Wow.
Jesus rose from the dead. Well, I didn't realize you can actually go and visit the tomb of Muhammad or the
Yeah.
burial place of Confucius. You can't visit the place for Buddha because he was uh, cremated, but you can. There are still
Right.
bones around there somewhere of what he did. I thought that was just kind of fascinating. Um,
Yeah.
and then the one that was kind of the most interesting was answering those questions about why would God allow pain and suffering.
Hmm.
And I really did some study in the book of Job because that's a big issue for Job. Obviously, here's a good man. He's being God initiates the suffering for Job. And then why would God allow those kinds of things? And so I looked up different types of issues. For example, one of them is with regard to uh, conjoined twins. Conjoined twins are what people generally say are Siamese twins. And there's these conjoined twins, Laura and Reba Chappelle. They're conjoined at the head. Interestingly, one looks
Hmm.
forward, the other one looks backward, so they can never actually see themselves.
Whoa.
One of them is significantly shorter than the other.
Hmm,
And so, why would God, and if you tried to separate them, they'd both die.
hmm.
So, why would God ever allow that to happen? That was a big
Yeah.
issue that I thought needs to be done. And I remember contacting a friend of mine who's a military person in the Navy, and his wife gave me a couple of books on tortured prisoners of war in North Vietnam, and what was their experience there, and how did that happen? And so those were some interesting things that I discovered in the course of what I was doing in my research.
Wow.
Yeah, in chapter 3, it's titled "What is God Like?" And you talk about how there's a still small voice that we all have, and I think that's different than the still small voice than the storm with I think it's Elijah or Elisha, one of those guys. But yeah, can you explain how our inner voice, our still small voice, is an evidence of God's existence?
Yeah, that's a good question. The still small voice I'm talking about is the voice of conscience. That there's something inside your heart that says you ought to do something, you ought to do what's right, you ought to do good. And it's pretty consistent. Different cultures have different definitions of what good is, but it's always something that is good. I have a close friend of mine, in fact, not a real close friend, but he's a fairly good friend, David Constan, who actually put a blurb on the cover of my original book, Heaven's Doors. He's a professor of classics, emeritus professor of classics at Brown University and professor of classics at New York University currently.
Wow.
And just brilliant guy. He reads all these classic guys, Aristotle and Plato and all these. Well, one day I actually sent him a copy of my book. He was willing to read one chapter at a time. And so I did. And he got back to me in his inimitable way. And he said, yeah, when you talked about conscience, there's a story Plato writes about his conversation with Socrates, where Socrates said to him, he always, even from a little boy, he had this little voice in his mind that told him always what to do, or always to do what was right. And he said he always followed that, or at least he always tried to follow that. And then he says, and this is actually in Plato, he says, that's why I'm not a politician.
Wow.
I thought that was just profound. That was amazing. I don't have that in my book, but that was just an interesting little comment about that. But the voice of conscience, that there is something inside every single human being that tells him to do the right thing, what is good. And that kind of indicates that there's whoever it is that created us, or if there's this being outside, that he's got some element of him that is good. Now, it can be confused and whatever it is. In fact, I mentioned in the book, there's an Native American proverb that says, your conscience is like a square block inside your heart. And every time it turns, the edges dig into your heart and it hurts. But if it turns too often, the edges break down and it doesn't hurt so much. And so you do have people that are, their consciences have been seared. I guess that would be a biblical view of that. And but that's what happens there. But there's something that says God is good. Now, it's not clearly defined what good is, but with each person, they know that there's something that is good, and I'm obligated to do it. Because when I don't do it, I feel guilty, or I'm accused by my own conscience that you did it wrong. And when you do it right, you've got this feeling of, yeah, I did it right. So that's kind of where God comes from.
Yeah. So with that, a little pushback I feel like some atheists could throw out there is, could that just be like the society you grew up in, programming that's playing back? Like you were raised around these moral values and that's all you know, so it's recited back. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. The problem is that even when you're involved in the mafia type thing, they know that there are some things that are good and some things that are not. It goes against what the culture says. There are things that every culture will say, and yet my conscience says this is not really right. And there's something about the conscience that every single person has. And there's something different in the various cultures. That's why you need to have something more than just the conscience to guide you. That's how we get into the biblical direction. That if there is a God who shows his power in the universe. I mean, if you just look out and you see this phenomenal size and complexity of the universe, it just boggles your mind when you see, we can't see all the way to the end of where the universe goes. And if we look at our microscopes, we can't see all the end of how small it is. I mean, it just goes almost infinitely in both directions. just this phenomenal complex stuff that we have. I think I mentioned in there that the DNA molecule that we have in our body, as it transmits information about who we are, et cetera, is something like 40 or 43 trillion times more accurate than our computer chips are.
Mm-hmm.
It's phenomenal, what God is able to do and how complex it is. Well, that shows you how that God must be wise, and he must be powerful, because the size of the universe is really big. But it doesn't tell you any more about who God is. And there's some aspect of him being good, but you don't know exactly what that means. That's why you have to have something more. And that's why I think God gave this document to mankind to inform mankind of who he really is, what his requirements are, et cetera, to give a clearer view of who God is.
Yeah, the complexity part's fascinating. And almost every scientist agrees that the universe is fine-tuned. Their just assumption is not that it's a miracle or that it's God. Well, they would say it's a miracle, but they wouldn't say it's God. They would just say it's chance or has to be that way or something like that.
Yeah, it's like going to Las Vegas and expecting that you're going to come away making a lot of money. Well,
it's natural. That's what should happen.
Probably not.
Yeah.